November 1971, Palm Springs, California. The emergency room at Desert Hospital was unusually quiet for a Friday night, the waiting area nearly empty except for an elderly couple and a young mother with a feverish child. At approximately 11:45, a black limousine pulled into the ambulance bay, and a man emerged clutching his chest, his face obscured by sunglasses, and a fedora pulled low despite the darkness outside. Two companions helped him through the doors and demanded immediate attention from the staff who rushed to assess the new arrival. The triage nurse on duty that night was a 34-year-old woman named Margaret Rose Chen, the daughter of Chinese immigrants who had raised her to treat every person with equal respect, regardless of their status or circumstances. She had worked at Desert Hospital for 8 years, long enough to have seen celebrities and politicians pass through the emergency room seeking treatment for conditions they preferred to keep private from the public that consumed their every move. Margaret approached the new patient with the same calm efficiency she brought to every medical emergency, her training overriding any curiosity about why someone would wear sunglasses indoors at nearly midnight. She asked him to describe his symptoms while guiding him toward a treatment bay, her hands already reaching for the blood pressure cuff that would provide the first objective data about his condition. The two men who had accompanied him tried to intervene, insisting that a doctor be called immediately and that the patient receive special treatment befitting someone of his importance. Margaret ignored them with the professional detachment that years of dealing with demanding families had taught her, focusing entirely on the man who was actually experiencing the medical emergency rather than those who merely wanted to feel useful. She asked him directly whether he was experiencing chest pain, shortness of breath, radiating discomfort down his left arm, or any of the other classic symptoms that might indicate a cardiac event requiring immediate intervention. Her voice was calm but firm, brooking no interference from the companions who continued to hover anxiously at the edges of the treatment bay. The patient answered her questions with a voice that was hoarse but cooperative, describing symptoms that had begun approximately 2 hours earlier during dinner at a restaurant where he had been celebrating something he did not specify. The pain had started as pressure in his chest, had intensified over the following hour, and had finally driven him to seek medical attention despite his preference for handling such matters privately. Margaret called for an EKG machine while continuing her assessment, noting the patient's vital signs on the chart that would document every aspect of his treatment from this moment forward. His blood pressure was elevated, his pulse rapid but regular, his respiration somewhat labored but not critically compromised. The symptoms were concerning but not immediately life-threatening. She asked him to remove his jacket so she could attach the EKG leads, and when his companions moved to help him, she politely but firmly asked them to wait outside the treatment bay where they would not interfere with the medical procedures that needed to be performed. They protested, but something in Margaret's manner made clear that argument was pointless. The patient himself intervened on her behalf, telling his companions to do as the nurse asked, and wait outside where they could contact his physician and make whatever arrangements needed to be made for his care. His voice carried authority, despite his obvious discomfort, the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed even when giving orders while experiencing a potential cardiac event. Margaret helped him remove his jacket and began attaching the EKG leads to his chest, her movements practiced and efficient after thousands of similar procedures performed over her years in the emergency room. She worked in silence, allowing the patient to rest while she prepared to gather the data that would guide the next steps in his treatment. The sunglasses remained in place throughout this process, an affectation that Margaret found mildly curious, but not worth commenting on, given the more pressing concerns of his cardiac symptoms. Some patients had quirks that needed to be accommodated, and if this man wanted to wear sunglasses while having his heart monitored, that was his prerogative as long as it did not interfere with her ability to provide care. The EKG machine hummed to life, its needles tracing patterns on the paper that would reveal whether the patient's heart was in immediate danger or merely protesting against some temporary insult. Margaret watched the readout with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to interpret cardiac rhythms almost instinctively, her assessment forming even before the machine completed its cycle. She saw irregularities that warranted concern, but not panic, patterns that suggested stress and strain rather than the acute damage that would require immediate intervention. The patient was having a cardiac event of some kind, but it appeared to be manageable rather than catastrophic, at least based on the initial data she was gathering. The doctor on call arrived and began reviewing the EKG, while Margaret continued to monitor the patient's vital signs. They spoke in the abbreviated language of medical professionals, exchanging information about symptoms, readings, and treatment options in terms that excluded the patient from the conversation about his own body. Margaret noticed that the patient was watching her, rather than the doctor, his gaze fixed on her face with an intensity that she might have found unsettling in other circumstances, but that seemed merely curious given his current vulnerability. She met his eyes briefly, offering the reassuring smile that she gave to all patients who were frightened about what was happening inside their bodies. Before continuing with this investigation, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in that emergency room in Palm Springs in November 1971 involves one of the most powerful men in entertainment at his most vulnerable, a nurse who treated him like any other patient, and a connection that would transform both their lives in ways neither could have predicted. By the end of this story, you will understand why Frank Sinatra never forgot the woman who saw him as human when his heart was failing and his fame meant nothing. Francis Albert Sinatra had been experiencing symptoms for weeks before the night that brought him to Desert Hospital, ignoring warning signs that his body was sending because acknowledging them would have required him to confront a mortality that he preferred to deny. He was 55 years old, had smoked heavily for decades, drank more than his doctors recommended, and lived with stress levels that would have broken men half his age. The retirement he had announced earlier that year had been partly motivated by health concerns that he had not shared publicly, a recognition that the pace he had maintained for 3 decades was no longer sustainable. But retirement had not brought the peace he had anticipated, replacing the stress of performance with the stress of purposelessness that was arguably even more damaging to a man who had defined himself entirely through his work. The dinner that evening had been with old friends, a celebration of nothing in particular, except the desire to feel connected to the life he had supposedly left behind. The food had been rich, the drinks had been plentiful, and the conversation had touched on memories of performances and recordings that now seemed to belong to someone else, a younger man whose energy he could no longer access. The chest pain had started during dessert, a pressure that he initially attributed to overeating, but that intensified rather than fading as the meal concluded. He had excused himself to the restroom, had stood gripping the sink while waiting for the discomfort to pass, and had finally admitted to his companions that something was wrong when he emerged pale and sweating despite the restaurant's air conditioning. The decision to seek treatment had been made for him by friends who recognized the signs of a cardiac event and who overruled his protests that he simply needed rest and would be fine in the morning. They had bundled him into the limousine and driven to the nearest hospital, bypassing the celebrity-friendly facilities in Los Angeles because the situation seemed too urgent for a 90-minute drive. The sunglasses and hat had been a last-minute attempt to preserve anonymity in a situation where his famous face might attract attention that would complicate an already frightening experience. Sinatra had spent his entire adult life being recognized, and the prospect of having a heart attack in public, surrounded by strangers with cameras and questions, was almost as terrifying as the cardiac event itself. But the nurse who had taken charge of his care seemed completely unaffected by any curiosity about his identity, treating him with a brisk efficiency that he found simultaneously irritating and refreshing. She asked about his symptoms, not his career. She measured his vital signs, not his fame. She saw a patient, not a legend. Margaret Chen had been raised in a household where celebrities were not worshipped, where her immigrant parents had emphasized that all people deserved equal treatment regardless of their status in the strange hierarchies that Americans seemed to construct around wealth and fame. A movie star and a plumber were equally deserving of respect, equally capable of kindness or cruelty, equally human beneath the superficial markers that others used to sort them into categories. Her father had been a doctor in China before the family emigrated, forced to start over as a restaurant worker when American medical boards refused to recognize his credentials. He had taught Margaret that healing was the highest calling, that the privilege of caring for another person's body was sacred regardless of who that person was or what they had accomplished in the world outside the hospital walls. She had encountered famous patients before during her years at Desert Hospital, recognizing some from movies or television shows that she watched occasionally when her schedule permitted. She treated them exactly as she treated everyone else, with competence and compassion that made no distinctions based on celebrity status that she considered irrelevant to the medical care they required. The man in the sunglasses was clearly someone important, given the limousine and the companions who insisted on special treatment. But Margaret had learned that the most important people in any emergency room were the ones whose lives were actually in danger, and that importance was measured in vital signs and symptoms rather than net worth or name recognition. She completed the EKG attachment and watched the readout appear, her trained eye identifying patterns that told a story about this man's heart that he probably did not want to hear. Years of stress had left their marks on the muscle that pumped blood through his body, damage that was not catastrophic, but that warned of worse to come if changes were not made. The doctor consulted briefly with Margaret about medication options, asking her opinion in the way that good physicians learned to respect the experience of nurses, who often spent more time with patients than doctors could afford to. She recommended a course of treatment that prioritized stabilization while they waited for more complete test results. Throughout this conversation, the patient watched and listened, without the demanding behavior that Margaret had come to expect from people who were accustomed to being in control of every situation they encountered. He seemed almost curious about the process, as if observing medical professionals at work was a novel experience, despite the wealth that presumably gave him access to the finest healthcare money could buy. The medication she administered began to take effect, and Margaret noted the improvement in his vital signs, with the satisfaction that every nurse felt when a patient responded positively to treatment. His breathing eased, his pulse steadied, and the pain lines around his eyes softened, though they did not disappear entirely. She asked if he was comfortable, if he needed anything, if the lighting was too bright or the room too cold. The questions were routine, asked of every patient as part of the holistic care that good nursing required, attention to comfort that complemented the technical aspects of medical treatment. He thanked her in a voice that was stronger now, steadier, more like the voice she suspected he used when he was healthy and in command of whatever world he normally inhabited. Then he reached up and removed the sunglasses that had concealed his identity throughout the treatment, revealing a face that Margaret recognized immediately, despite having paid it no special attention when it was hidden. Frank Sinatra looked at her with blue eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and curiosity, waiting to see how she would react to the revelation that the patient she had been treating so matter-of-factly was one of the most famous men in America. He had experienced every possible reaction to his fame over the decades, from screaming adoration to calculated manipulation, and he wondered which version this composed nurse would display. Margaret's expression did not change. She noted the famous face with the same professional detachment she had shown throughout the treatment, acknowledging the information without allowing it to affect her behavior in any way. She asked if the medication was helping with his chest pain, whether he was experiencing any side effects, whether there was anything else she could do to make him more comfortable while they waited for additional test results. Sinatra was startled by her lack of reaction, so accustomed to his presence causing some kind of response that indifference seemed almost impossible. He asked if she knew who he was, not from ego, but from genuine curiosity about whether she was simply unaware of his identity, or whether she was choosing to ignore it for reasons he could not fathom. Margaret confirmed that she knew exactly who he was, that she had recognized him the moment he removed his sunglasses. But she explained that his identity was irrelevant to the care he needed, that her job was to treat his heart condition rather than his celebrity, and that she hoped he would not expect different treatment simply because he was famous in a world that existed outside the walls of her emergency room. The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour, extending far beyond the medical necessities that had brought them together. Sinatra found himself talking to Margaret in ways that he rarely talked to anyone, sharing fears and frustrations that he normally concealed behind the persona that the public expected from Frank Sinatra. He told her about the retirement that was supposed to bring peace, but had instead brought emptiness. About the heart symptoms he had ignored, because acknowledging them meant acknowledging mortality. About the loneliness that fame created, by making genuine connection almost impossible with people who saw the legend rather than the man. Margaret listened with the same attentive calm she brought to every patient interaction, responding occasionally with questions that demonstrated she was following his words without judgment, or the sycophancy that he normally encountered from people who wanted something from him. She treated his emotional pain with the same respect she had shown his physical symptoms. The tests confirmed what the EKG had suggested: cardiac damage that was significant but not immediately life-threatening, the accumulated result of decades of stress and unhealthy habits that would require lifestyle changes if Sinatra wanted to avoid more serious events in the future. The doctor delivered this news with the gravity it deserved, while emphasizing that the prognosis was manageable with proper care. Sinatra was kept overnight for observation, standard procedure for cardiac patients whose conditions needed monitoring. Margaret's shift ended at 7 in the morning, and she stopped by his room before leaving to check on him one final time and to wish him well with the recovery that lay ahead. He asked for her full name, which she provided, and thanked her for treating him like a human being, rather than a commodity to be exploited or a legend to be worshipped. The words were simple, but carried a weight that Margaret understood came from years of experiencing the opposite, years of being treated as something other than the ordinary person he felt himself to be beneath the extraordinary fame. The following day, after his discharge from the hospital, Sinatra had his assistant research Margaret Rose Chen, learning details about her life that she would never have shared with a patient regardless of his fame. He discovered her immigrant background, her father's sacrifice in giving up his medical career, her dedication to nursing that had made her a respected figure at Desert Hospital, despite the discrimination she faced as an Asian woman in a profession dominated by whites. He also learned that Margaret had a daughter in nursing school, a young woman named Linda who was struggling to afford the tuition that would allow her to follow in her mother's footsteps. The information provided Sinatra with an opportunity to repay the kindness Margaret had shown him in a way that would make a tangible difference in her family's life. An anonymous scholarship was established at Linda's nursing school, fully funding her remaining education and eliminating the financial burden that had forced her to work multiple jobs while studying. The scholarship was attributed to a foundation with no obvious connection to Sinatra, and Margaret was never told directly that her treatment of a famous patient had resulted in her daughter's education being paid for in full. But Margaret suspected the truth, recognizing the timing of the scholarship and the fact that Linda had never applied for financial aid from the foundation that was supposedly sponsoring her. She said nothing, accepting the gift with the same grace she had shown in providing the care that had inspired it, understanding that some debts were best acknowledged through silence rather than explicit thanks. Sinatra returned to performing in 1973, ending a retirement that had lasted less than 2 years and that he later described as the worst decision he had ever made. His health had improved following the changes recommended after his cardiac event, and he credited the wake-up call he had received at Desert Hospital with forcing him to take seriously the warnings his body had been sending for years. He never forgot Margaret Rose Chen, the nurse who had treated him like any patient until he removed his sunglasses and who had continued treating him the same way even after learning who he was. Her indifference to his fame had been more valuable to him than any special treatment could have been, a reminder that his humanity was not erased by his celebrity, even if most people could not see past the legend to the man beneath. They met again in 1985 when Sinatra returned to Desert Hospital for a follow-up visit and specifically requested that Margaret be assigned to assist with his care. She was older now, as was he, both marked by the years that had passed since their first encounter, but both still recognizable as the people they had been on that November night in 1971. The reunion was warm but not sentimental, characterized by the same professional respect that had marked their original interaction. Margaret examined his chart, asked about his current symptoms, and provided care with the competence that had not diminished despite her advancing years. Sinatra watched her work with the same appreciation he had felt 14 years earlier. He told her during that visit about the scholarship for Linda, confessing what he suspected she already knew about the source of the funding that had allowed her daughter to complete nursing school without financial hardship. Margaret thanked him quietly, confirming that she had suspected his involvement but had chosen not to investigate because the gift was more meaningful if it came without strings or expectations. Linda had become an excellent nurse, Margaret told him, working at a hospital in San Francisco, where she had developed a reputation for treating every patient with equal respect, regardless of their status. The lesson Margaret had taught by example had been passed to the next generation, a legacy that would continue to influence how patients were treated long after both Margaret and Sinatra were gone. The friendship that developed between them in the years following that 1985 reunion was unlike any other in Sinatra's life, based not on entertainment industry connections or business interests, but on a mutual respect that had been forged in a moment of vulnerability when one human being had cared for another, without regard for fame or wealth. Margaret attended Sinatra's final concerts in the 1990s, sitting in seats he arranged for her whenever he performed within driving distance of Palm Springs. She watched him command stages with a presence that seemed to defy the years that had accumulated since their first meeting, marveling at the energy he could still summon despite the cardiac damage that she knew lurked beneath his performance persona. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998, and Margaret was among those who received private notification before the news became public. She did not attend the funeral, preferring to mourn privately in the way she had always approached her relationship with the man she had first met, as simply another patient requiring care. The scholarship program that Sinatra had established anonymously was revealed after his death as one of his many philanthropic initiatives, and Margaret's role in inspiring it was finally acknowledged publicly. She gave interviews reluctantly, always emphasizing that she had simply done her job and that any nurse would have treated the patient the same way, regardless of his identity. But those who knew the full story understood that Margaret's particular gift was precisely her ability to see past fame to humanity, to treat a legend as a person, and thereby provide something that his celebrity could not buy. The experience of being truly seen for who he was, rather than what he represented to a world that had placed him on a pedestal he had never entirely wanted to occupy. Margaret Rose Chen died on August 7, 2014, at the age of 77, surrounded by family that included her daughter Linda, her grandchildren, and the legacy of compassionate care that she had demonstrated throughout her career. Her obituary mentioned her connection to Frank Sinatra, but she would have considered that the least important part of a life dedicated to treating every patient with equal dignity. The emergency room at Desert Hospital, where Margaret and Sinatra first met, has been renovated multiple times since 1971. The original treatment bay replaced by modern equipment and updated facilities that would be unrecognizable to anyone who worked there during the era when their encounter took place. But the principles that Margaret embodied remain central to the hospital's mission. Linda Chen established a nursing award in her mother's name, presented annually to a nurse who demonstrates exceptional commitment to treating every patient with equal respect, regardless of their background or status. The recipients are chosen based on their ability to see humanity in patients who might otherwise be reduced to diagnoses or demographics. The sunglasses that Sinatra wore that night were kept by him until his death, a memento of the moment when he had been seen as a person rather than a persona by someone whose opinion mattered, precisely because it was not influenced by his fame. They were among the personal effects distributed to family members after his passing. Documentary filmmakers have explored the story of Margaret and Sinatra multiple times, each project attempting to capture the significance of an encounter that seemed unremarkable on the surface, but that carried profound meaning for both participants. The challenge is always to convey why indifference to celebrity was itself a gift. The nursing profession continues to attract people like Margaret, who find meaning in caring for others, regardless of who those others might be in the world beyond the hospital walls. Her story is sometimes shared in nursing education as an example of the professional detachment that allows care to be delivered without distortion. Linda's children grew up knowing the story of their grandmother and Frank Sinatra as a family legend that connected them to entertainment history, while also teaching them about values that transcended fame and fortune. They understood that their grandmother's greatest accomplishment was not knowing a celebrity, but treating one as human. The cardiac event that brought Sinatra to Desert Hospital was a turning point that forced him to confront aspects of his lifestyle that had been damaging his health for decades. The lifestyle changes he made following that night added years to his life and allowed him to continue performing long after many of his contemporaries had been forced into permanent retirement. Margaret's approach to nursing was shaped by her father's example, a man who had been stripped of his credentials but not his commitment to healing when he emigrated from China to a country that did not recognize his medical training. His sacrifice taught her that healing was a calling rather than merely a profession. The relationship between celebrity and healthcare workers has been explored extensively by researchers, who note that famous patients often receive different treatment than ordinary people, sometimes better and sometimes worse, depending on the dynamics of the specific situation. Margaret represented the ideal of equal treatment that is easier to espouse than to practice. Sinatra's philanthropy in healthcare extended far beyond the scholarship he established for Linda, including donations to hospitals and medical research that continued throughout his life. But the personal nature of his gift to Margaret's family reflected a gratitude that went beyond general charitable impulses to specific appreciation for what she had given him. The November night when their paths crossed has become part of the larger narrative about Sinatra's complicated health history, a story that includes multiple cardiac events and ongoing struggles with conditions that would have killed a less resilient man decades earlier. His survival was attributed partly to luck and partly to the wake-up calls that forced him to take his health seriously. The treatment bay where Margaret first attached EKG leads to Sinatra's chest exists now only in memory, replaced by technology and techniques that have transformed emergency medicine in ways that would have seemed miraculous to practitioners of her era. But the human element she brought to patient care remains irreplaceable regardless of technological advancement. Every nurse who has heard Margaret's story carries a piece of her legacy into their own practice, a reminder that the famous and the anonymous deserve equal compassion when they arrive in emergency rooms seeking help for conditions that reduce all humans to the same vulnerable state. The lesson is simple but profound. See the person, not the persona. The cardiac rehabilitation program that Sinatra followed after his discharge from Desert Hospital was supervised by physicians who understood that their famous patient would require approaches tailored to his lifestyle and personality. Margaret consulted on the program informally, offering insights about patient motivation that her years of nursing had taught her. She understood that Sinatra's identity was wrapped up in his ability to perform, that asking him to slow down permanently was asking him to become someone other than himself. The challenge was finding balance between the demands of his career and the requirements of his recovering heart, a negotiation that required wisdom rather than rigid adherence to standard protocols. The lifestyle changes that Sinatra implemented following his cardiac event included reduced alcohol consumption, modified diet, and stress management techniques that would have seemed absurd to the man who had lived at full intensity for 5 decades. He approached these changes with the same discipline he had brought to his career, recognizing that survival required adaptation. Margaret received occasional updates about his progress through the hospital's informal networks, colleagues who treated his follow-up appointments and who knew of her connection to the famous patient she had first encountered that November night. She followed his recovery with professional interest and personal investment that she rarely felt for former patients. The announcement of his return to performing in 1973 reached Margaret through the same media that informed the rest of the world, though she experienced it differently than most viewers who simply saw a celebrity ending an unpopular retirement. She understood what that return meant in terms of his health, the risks he was accepting, the statement he was making about what mattered most to him. She sent a card to his management office, brief congratulations on his return that carried no expectation of response or recognition. The card was one of thousands that Sinatra received, but his staff had been instructed to flag any correspondence from Margaret Rose Chen, and it was delivered to him personally within hours of its arrival. He called her at the hospital the following week, a conversation that surprised the nurses' station when they realized who was on the line asking to speak with their colleague. Margaret took the call in a private office, speaking with the same calm professionalism she had displayed during their first encounter, even though the circumstances were entirely different. Sinatra thanked her for the card and for the care she had provided, updating her on his health in terms that suggested he valued her opinion as both a medical professional and as someone who had seen him at his most vulnerable. The conversation lasted 20 minutes and established a pattern of communication that would continue for years. Linda Chen graduated from nursing school in 1974, the anonymous scholarship having covered her final 2 years of education without the financial stress that had been crushing her before its unexpected arrival. She joined the staff of a hospital in San Francisco, beginning a career that would eventually span 4 decades and touch thousands of patients. She never knew definitively that Frank Sinatra had funded her education until after both he and her mother had died, when documents discovered during estate proceedings revealed the connection that Margaret had suspected but never confirmed. The discovery added new dimensions to a family story that had already seemed remarkable enough without this additional chapter. The relationship between Margaret and Sinatra evolved over the years from patient and nurse to something that defied easy categorization, a friendship built on a foundation of mutual respect that had been established in the most unlikely of circumstances. They spoke by phone every few months, conversations that ranged from health updates to personal reflections on lives that had intersected so improbably. Sinatra invited Margaret to attend one of his concerts in 1976, an invitation she initially declined because she did not want special treatment that might compromise the equality that had defined their relationship from the beginning. He understood her hesitation and arranged for her to attend anonymously, purchasing a ticket through normal channels so she could experience his performance as an ordinary audience member. She sat in the crowd at the Greek Theatre in Los Angeles, watching him command the stage with an energy that seemed to contradict the cardiac damage she knew lurked beneath his performance persona. The voice was still extraordinary, the presence still magnetic, the connection with the audience still electric despite the years and the health challenges that might have diminished a lesser artist. After the concert, she made her way backstage, using a pass that had been left for her at will call, navigating corridors crowded with celebrities and industry figures who paid her no attention as she sought the dressing room where Sinatra was receiving guests. She waited patiently while others cycled through their brief audiences with the legend, in no hurry to claim time that she did not feel entitled to demand. When she finally reached him, Sinatra dismissed the remaining visitors with a gesture that communicated his desire for privacy without requiring explanation. The room emptied quickly, leaving only the two of them in a space that still hummed with the energy of the performance that had concluded an hour earlier. He asked for her professional assessment of how he had looked on stage, whether she had noticed any signs of fatigue or strain that might indicate problems with his ongoing cardiac management. The question was partly joking but partly serious, reflecting his continued respect for her medical expertise and her ability to see him clearly when others saw only the performance. Margaret told him honestly that he had looked remarkable for a man who had experienced the cardiac event she had witnessed 4 years earlier, that whatever lifestyle changes he had implemented appeared to be working, and that she hoped he would continue to take his health seriously even as he returned to the demanding schedule that performance required. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, ranging across topics that included his career, her work at the hospital, the daughter whose education he had secretly funded, and the strange gift that his cardiac event had given both of them, a relationship that existed entirely outside the normal frameworks of celebrity and fan, patient and caregiver. When Margaret finally left the dressing room, she carried with her an invitation to visit Sinatra at his Palm Springs home whenever her schedule permitted, an offer that she would eventually accept, though months would pass before she found the time and the courage to take him up on the gesture of friendship that it represented. The visit to Palm Springs occurred in the spring of 1977, a weekend during which Margaret experienced a world entirely different from the emergency rooms and patient wards that had defined her professional life. Sinatra's compound was luxurious in ways that she had never witnessed firsthand, yet he seemed most comfortable when they sat together in simple conversation. Two people who had found connection despite circumstances that should have kept them forever apart. Rest in peace, Margaret Rose Chen. Your hands healed more than hearts during your years as a nurse, teaching by example that every person deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of the fame or fortune that others use to measure worth. And rest in peace, Francis Albert Sinatra. The voice that made millions swoon was just another heartbeat in that emergency room, and the woman who heard it without being impressed by the name attached to it gave you a gift that your fame could never buy, the experience of being human when everyone else insisted on seeing you as a legend.